Hey, welcome to my latest installation of my Study the Great series where we're going to cover George Inness's great painting, Sunset Over Sea. Going to use a somewhat limited palette, and I'm going to paint on my hardwood painting board covered in several layers of gesso. And here's a quick shot of what this original painting of George Inness's looks like on my iPad. But my painting board is essentially sanded multiple times, covered with multiple layers of gesso, sanded each time it dries, and then a thin coat of black oil paint is applied, and let that dry, and then it's ready for use. And here we go. Just applying some quick lines using a flat brush, half-inch flat brush, I believe. I'm not sure what number that is. It might be number 5 or number 6. And I'm using a mixture of Payne's Gray and burnt umber, and just putting in some initial lines covering up the board, intended to indicate some of the main base colors in the sky and also establish the horizon line as well. I'll work my way through as quickly as I can, covering the board as quickly as I can, starting with thin paint, thinned purely with boiled linseed oil. And my goal with each initial application here in this first phase of the painting is to have a thickness and viscosity that is akin to watercolor paints. And this is done intentionally for several reasons. It is just much easier to paint over thin paint as we apply additional subsequent layers. And then it also is much easier to apply this paint as it moves. You can push it around on the board and apply it much more quickly, which is really important in the beginning phases of the painting. So this painting, originally done by George Inness, called Sunset Over the Sea, was done somewhere around 1887. He too completed his painting on a panel, wood panel. His is much larger than mine. I'm working on a 5-inch by 7-inch board. His was originally done on a board that was 22 inches by 36.1 inches, so 22 by 36.1 inches. An interesting thing about this painting, for those on the East Coast like myself, apparently it is hung in the Brooklyn Museum, and it was painted in the United States. I'm not exactly sure, which coast or where the location was. But I do know that he was born and raised in Newburgh, New York, and he traveled all over the place, but he did spend quite a bit of time living in New York and New Jersey. And so I imagine this could very well be based upon a scene that maybe he witnessed at some point in time at the Jersey Shore or off of one of the New York beaches. He also spent quite a bit of time in Massachusetts as well. So, who knows? Kind of irrelevant, especially giving consideration to his style of painting, at least the style of painting he evolved to later in his career. His tonalism or tonalist style works, oftentimes were built based upon memory and imagination. So I imagine that could be the case with this scene as well. A couple things that I'll note as it relates to my approach here. I am not looking to establish a photocopy of his original work. What I am trying to do is to use this series as a way to up-level my own painting ability. And by publishing my progress, as I'm doing here, I am looking to help others that could use a free, easily accessible resource to help themselves do the same. And I'm not necessarily aiming at a photorealistic copy. I'm aiming at trying to achieve something close to what these original works were aimed at. And in this case, as is well documented about his other works, I believe Inness was just looking to create a feeling as it relates to this scene. And I imagine it's one that's a bit of a paradox. You have, this beautiful somber sunset literally on top of, with the configuration of this painting, what looks to be an angry, somewhat raging sea. And it's kind of an interesting paradox, and it's one that you see quite often on the coast. Either if a storm is passing, or there might be a hurricane off the shore somewhere, or if maybe there's a storm approaching. So, I've seen this painting quite a bit throughout my life, and I've always admired it. And one of the things here that I'm almost regretful of is I think I'm going to have to leave some of the detail out just because of the small scale that I'm working on here. So you've seen at this point, I've applied more of that burnt umber mixture, but also while I was talking, I had applied a mixture of yellow ochre, sap green, and a little tiny bit of Payne's gray and titanium white. And it's just meant to kind of create the hint of some of the sea foam and sea spray, at least the shadowy, darker parts of it for later. And now I am kind of assessing what it is that I'd like to do next. And I kind of like this painting at this phase because some of the white spots on the paint board, on the hardboard, that are showing through the black oil paint that's serving as the underpainting are kind of shining through, and they look like stars. So now I am kind of tinkering with the use of some transparent colors and trying to figure out a way to creatively build out that little cutout or sky hole through the clouds, with which you can see a little bit of the clearer sky reflecting off in the distance, off of a distant set of clouds. And the way I approach this, I used a little bit of ultramarine blue here, mixed with titanium white, a little tiny bit of sap green, and just going to play with that until I get it close to what I want to be in this painting. And right now I'm just playing around with the different shapes that I see throughout the painting, looking to still at this point fill up the whole canvas. As you can see, the paint is very transparent. Just a very little bit of paint actually suspended in a lot of linseed oil. And that's why we have these kind of transparent hues, giving some indication of some of the bottoms of the clouds that are picking up some of the reflections of light off the water and off the horizon, and refining that shape of that little sky hole near the upper left-hand corner of the painting here. I'm taking a quick look, trying to figure out what to do next. As always is the case with these paintings, I'm really putting off the urge to focus any attention at all on highlights, and trying to focus mainly on the darker tones and the shadow patterns and midtones, holding back and reserving energy and effort that I'll ultimately invest in getting highlights into the painting for later on. So right now I'm knocking back and knocking down some of the tones, trying to build in some of the darker shapes, both in the water and in the sky, hoping that that'll help build three-dimensional, the illusion of three-dimensionality as we move forward in the painting, and also build some more defined shapes amongst the waves and also the clouds in the sky. And you can kind of see that happening right now, just a little bit. At this point, I'm starting to focus on building in a couple of different layers of color in the sky. And you can see that in some of the light shining through that little sky hole. And then also amongst the clouds, you can see more indications of light bouncing off of the clouds surrounding that lighter area. And I'm also refining some of the darker areas out near the horizon on the water, and then also within the waves tumbling forward toward shore here. And a couple times you've seen a little thumbnail image of the original painting show up in the upper right. That's really just intended to serve as a reminder, of what the painting, the original painting looks like, but also how I'm trying to capture some of the basic shapes, and also perhaps maybe an indication of how imprecise I'm being, intentionally not wanting to necessarily create a photocopy, but just go after some of the elements in the painting, learn a little bit about how to create some of these effects. Mind you, George Inness probably used a whole panoply of techniques, and which included, in many cases, dry brushing and glazing and different techniques that require the paint to be fully dry. And in this case here, with this little painting that I'm doing, this little study, I'm painting alla prima in one sitting, applying wet paint on wet paint, known as wet on wet painting. And I'm going to be somewhat limited in the effects that I can achieve. However, in this exercise, I inevitably do learn quite a bit. I've done at this point close to 25 or 30 paintings in my Study the Great series, and I've covered George Inness quite a few times, but also Charles Warren Eaton, Ed Bannister. More recently, I've covered Monet and Van Gogh. And in each attempt, there is a sufficient amount of failure in the effort to create these paintings, and that's usually where I learn the most, not to sound too cliche. But I also learn with a lot of pleasant surprises in how I'm able to easily create effects which are similar, or at least not too different than the original painting. And oftentimes I'm kind of searching in the dark because there aren't a lot of good notes available, and I by no means am a classically trained artist or an art historian. So just kind of feeling my way through these, and it's quite a bit of fun, and definitely I feel has been helping me progress in my painting practice. So here I'm trying to create some indication of different movement in the water. Most of my brushstrokes had been right to left, kind of on a horizontal plane, and now I'm trying to vary them a little bit more. I'm also taking some of that darker paint color, which has a little bit of the paint being used in the ocean, and I'm bringing that up into the sky. And I'm doing that for a couple reasons. One, I'm hoping to create some color harmony, but two, there is in reality there's usually quite a bit of color reflection that bounces back and forth between the sky and the water in these sorts of scenes. So anyway, going to keep working my way through and build some more definition as I go at this point forward, particularly in the wave movements and the shapes that are created from them. Okay, now we're at the point where we're going to start experimenting with some highlights in the attempt to create the illusion of some of the foamy water and sea spray that's coming up. And we're using a mixture of mostly titanium white tinted a little bit with some sap green. And we are going to just work our way through here and building up some of these shapes. Not too worried about whether or not it looks realistic at this point, whether or not we're kind of honoring the texture or the textural elements all that much. We just want to build out the shapes quickly. At this point, if we worry too much about whether or not it's looking like sea foam or it's looking like sea spray, it will take a ridiculous amount of time, even with a small painting like this, to cover the ground that we need to cover. So just looking to lay it in quickly. I want to make sure that there's breaks in the paint, in the lighter paint, because in reality, that's the only way we're going to be able to create the illusion of detail of choppy water and actual waves breaking and developing or generating sea foam and sea spray throughout the seascape. And you can see right here, I applied a little bit of that mixture, a little bit too heavy-handedly, and just going to wipe it off with my shop towel. And I rolled it up to a point and just kind of lifting some of that excess paint off at this point. I'll continue to work my way through as I've been doing over the past couple of minutes here. I'm using what I think is a number 4 round brush with a real stiff set of bristles. I find that when trying to create this kind of effect, I would liken it to a dry brush effect. However, it is technically not, because it's wet on wet paint here. But it's the same kind of thing. Very light dabs and strokes. With just a little tiny bit of the paint on the brush itself within the bristles. And just looking to create very haphazard paint application with lots of breaks, allowing the coats of paint underneath each application come through within the broken bristle strokes as I go. Now at this point, I'm sensing that some of the shapes I've laid in are a little too solid, so I'm going to use the back of my brush just to break them up a little bit and create some more variance. And in some cases, by moving the brush a little bit more quickly in a vertical kind of motion, creating the illusion of random sprays of water and sea foam coming up. So I'm just going to work my way through, looking to break this up a little bit. You saw it right there. That definitely was applied a little too heavy-handedly. So I'm just going to continue to work my way through in this manner until I feel good about where I'm leaving off. Take the next few minutes just to share a little bit more about George Inness. So what I've learned in some additional readings is that in the mid-1850s, which I guess is considered his early to mid-career, he was commissioned by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroads to create paintings which documented the progress of the railroad growth in early industrial America. The Lackawanna Valley was painted by Inness in 1855. It represents the railroad's first roundhouse at Scranton, Pennsylvania, and integrates technology and wilderness with an observed landscape. In time, not only would Inness shun the industrial presence in favor of bucolic and agrarian subjects, but he would also produce much of his mature works in the studio, drawing on visual memory to produce scenes that were often inspired by specific places, yet increasingly concerned with formal considerations. So I think it became more about process and feeling for him than it did, as it was earlier when he was painting from direct observation, which is kind of interesting. You see that with a lot of the painters from his era. And then mid-career, Inness moved from New York City to Medfield, Massachusetts in 1860, where he converted a barn into a studio. In 1862 or 63, he was an art teacher in the Charles Dorman Robinson. He then moved to Eagleswood, New Jersey in 1864, and he returned to Europe in the spring of 1870 and lived in Rome and toured in that area, Venice, and so on and so forth. In 1878, he returned to New York, taking a studio in the New York University building. In the same year, he also participated in the Universal Exposition in Paris, and he published art criticism in the New York Evening Post and the Harper's New Monthly magazine. And it's interesting, at this time, he spent quite a bit of time painting in the Catskill Mountains and also in northeastern Pennsylvania, western New Jersey. And I never would have known this if I didn't research it further, but Eagleswood Township, which I had never heard of, even though I grew up in New Jersey, is a township in Ocean County, New Jersey. And I guess he also, while spending time living in Eagleswood Township, he also spent quite a bit of time kind of in Stafford Township and Beach Haven and also in other parts of New Jersey, which are closer to the kind of more industrial areas associated with the state. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So at this point, the painting's coming along. The basic shapes are laid in. The one thing that you'll probably note, the contrast between my study and the original painting. I mentioned earlier, I left out certain elements, including what I'm ultimately deciding right here at this point is, whether or not I want to try to lay in the seagulls flying in the air, and ultimately I decide not to. Also, too, I'm growing a little concerned because in my painting here, my study of George Inness's original painting, you can see much more definition in the brushstrokes. And, I'm wondering to myself right now if I should pursue the kind of airy, very misty, kind of dry brush feeling, glazed effects, or if I should just keep going. And ultimately, I'm deciding here that I'm just going to keep going and, just accept the fact that, a lot of the elements of the painting are going to be very similar in my study. A lot of the composition is going to be very similar, and it's going to be reflective of George Inness's original painting. However, certain things are just going to be different. Some of the colors are a little different. I have a little bit more of a greenish blue kind of tint to my painting. And if you look up Sunset Over the Sea by George Inness, if you Google it, you'll see his painting. The sky has much more of a red to orange kind of overall tint to it than mine. And the contrast between the sky, that the beams of light kind of shining through that sky hole, and his more shadowy cloud-covered portions of his sky are a little less contrasted than you'll see in mine. I'm okay with that. So, and that's also part of the learning journey here. When you're doing these studies, you can, as long as you think through observations and judgments and make intentional, conscious decisions on what to work on, what to just let be, you really can learn a lot and avoid a ton of frustration as well as you go. So a lot of what we're going to do here is going to be, kind of an attempt to break up existing brush strokes and modulate and adjust highlights and lowlights and midtones, and also manipulate shapes just a little tiny bit to create the illusion of movement in the water, like I'm doing now, trying to create brush strokes, pulling down some of that paint from the highlights down in an angular curved way, intended to create the illusion of a three-dimensional wave moving across the top of the water and ultimately crashing. So I'll do that again on the right-hand side here with this smaller wave slightly closer to shore. And not really worrying about making mistakes, because I could always wipe paint off. And I could always apply paint overwards. And I want to apologize for the shadow. I have a long way to go when it comes to cinematography and how I'm going to, kind of light the scene here. I realize now that the lighting is off to my left, and I'm a left-handed painter, so that creates a shadow, and that wasn't intentional. So I know it's a little bit annoying. We'll work on getting better at those sorts of things as we go. I'm moving ahead here. I have a little mixture of a yellow orangey color that I'm going to apply mainly to the bottom portion of that sky hole and then down near the horizon line here as we move forward too. And I'll use it also to create highlights on some of the clouds. But the sunlight is breaking through the clouds near the horizon line during this sunset hour here in this painting, and much as it does in real life, that light, that golden orangey yellow light, will break through in random spots and weird spots and bounce off cloud shapes and stuff. So Inness does obviously a remarkably incredible job of capturing those sorts of effects. And one of the keys, particularly when you're working with paintings, trying to create the illusion of light shining through, is to really just relax and allow your arm and your hand to move with ease. If you get anxious, or if you feel like you need to be too precious with your brush strokes, you really get into trouble. So whatever it is you need to do to relax, whether it's a little bit of breathing and visualization, and as far as how your brush stroke's going to go, or whatever it is, you want to get in a relaxed frame of mind. And this should not be a tension-filled event. You should just envision how you're going to move your arm and your hand and your fingers in order to apply the paint, and just do it. And make sure you breathe while you go. Sometimes, if there's a lot of tension maybe outside of the studio, maybe it's work related, or maybe it's related to family things or what have you, just life in general. Sometimes when you get to this point in a painting, if you're like me, I might work through certain details and find that I haven't been breathing for a few minutes. And you just want to avoid those sorts of scenarios. You want to make sure that your time while you're painting here is relaxing and fun, because that's really what it's all about. And I think there's a lot of teachers that do a really good job of helping us painters get in the right mindset. And that mindset is definitely one of relaxation and calmness. And I don't mean in a sense where you're going to deplete your painting of all energy and passion. I mean from the standpoint of, it just should not be tension-filled when you apply the paint. It should be something that looks and feels natural as you go through. And hopefully I demonstrated that a little bit with some of these brush strokes here in the sky. Really important, because it does transmute and translate into a different application of the paint and a different look and feel in your painting if you're real tense, and you don't want that to happen. At this point, I'm gonna build on my pool of foamy whitish green mixture. I'm going to go through and build out some of those shapes a little bit more at this point. So now I'm just going to grab a little bit more of that yellowish golden color I have in the sky hole. And I'm just going to enhance some of what we have going on there with the light reflecting through and bouncing off some of the clouds in the far distant background behind the darker wall of clouds that we see surrounding it, and kind of like the way that looks so far. Thinking I'm going to work to enhance some of the highlights now. Some of the areas where the sun light might be poking through a little bit more directly, and then also work my way around and through the denser cloud cover. Just build up some highlights showing that light bouncing off the clouds, and maybe even bring it down into some of the waves as well. So I'm going to pull in a little bit more of the bright orange and yellow, but before I do that, I'm going to use my shop towel just to soften some of the edges here. I don't want to stray too far from the original. Noticing that my brush strokes are just a little too strong for my taste in this particular setting. All right, this looks okay. So I'm going to go ahead and work my way around that sky in just a little bit. Going to bring in some of that peachy orange color that I've mixed up on my palette. And I'm going to use that to build in some hints of some highlights, some light bouncing off of some of the darker clouds, and like I mentioned, pull it down into the ocean a little bit as well. I'm going to work here for a little bit, just continually kind of weave my way through the painting, enhancing shapes and highlights at this point. A little bit more than halfway done, I believe, but this is the area I'm going to work in for a little while. I'm just going to take a few brief moments here to try and further enhance the indication of movement, making some angular strokes on this wave in the foreground and pulling it down and across in the area on the beach there where the waves might be washing ashore. Pull it across gently, pulling in some of the white foam, whitish foam, definitely not pure white, but the whitish foam, along with some of the greenish blue that's making up the waves. And just looking for areas throughout that water that's churning there as the waves crash for opportunities to enhance the three-dimensional illusions and also the illusion of movement. As is always the case, just going to weave my way through this painting now back up to the sky. And I'm going to take my mixture of cadmium yellow and yellow ochre here, and a little bit of cadmium red, and put some more highlights on the clouds. And I'm looking at that horizon, and we definitely need to kind of pierce the veil of clouds a little bit closer to the horizon in just select areas here. And also put a couple dabs of paint throughout that sky hole. Create the indication of some floating clouds floating by on that separate plane of cloud field, kind of behind the darker plane of clouds in the front of the sky there. I'm also going to bring some of that color into the ocean, because it would reflect off of the ocean even though it's a little darker. I'm liking what we have going on here. We definitely get the illusion of three-dimensional plane on the ocean running back toward the horizon, like the way the sky hole is showing up, allowing the light to come through. And I'm just going to take my time here and make some decisions around the last few key marks that I put down and the alterations that I make to them as we move forward. Definitely felt like I needed to brighten up the bottom portion of that sky hole where the sun's rays would most directly be kind of bouncing off of the bottom portion of the cloud cover there. So it's going to continue to work on that just a little bit. And again, I apologize for the shadowy kind of elements in this footage. I aim to get better at the cinematography kind of aspect of these videos over time, but for now I definitely put the lighting in the wrong spot. Here we go. I'm just I added a little more cadmium red to that yellow mixture, and I'm using that to create some dappled light effects on some of the clouds closer to the sky hole, taking care not to brighten up the outer edges. We want the outer edges within the confines of this wood panel that I'm painting on to remain dark. Now I'm using the back of my paintbrush just to create some striations and break up some of the solid nature of some of those brush strokes at the bottom of the cloud cover there where the light's bouncing off. And I feel like I need to soften some of the hard edges here, so I'm going to take a dry 1-inch flat brush and has no paint on it. It's dry. Just going to make sure the bristles are free of any debris, and just very lightly, very gently, just going to come across the outer edges of the sky, and then I'll come down actually into the water in spots as well, just to soften some of the edges. I don't want there necessarily to be really sharp, harsh edges in the indications of those waves or the horizon line off into the distance, because naturally, being that it's further away, it'd be harder to see sharp detail. So I'm just going to soften that ever so gently with that dry 1-inch flat brush. It's basically a cheap hardware store brush. Probably costs less than 50 cents. Maybe a little bit more now due to inflation, who knows. And taking a step back, taking care to look and see what makes the most sense for me to do next, what will help elevate the painting. And I'm thinking that in select areas on the sea, on the ocean, just need to create the illusion of more chop and a little bit more kind of foaminess amongst the water, just to build that out a little bit more. Not only in the foreground here on the waves that are crashing near shore, but also in the background, just in select areas. So I'm going to take my mixture of mostly titanium white with a little bit of sap green, and in some cases also a little bit of ultramarine blue, just a tiny bit. And I'm going to use a couple different types of strokes, off in the distance, horizontal strokes, very light, gentle, almost with a dry brush kind of effect on this 1/2-inch round brush that I'm using. And then I'll use almost a direct dab or patting in the foreground with the hopes of creating the illusion of foam and spray. Off in the distance, horizontal, because that's the way it would appear as perspective comes into play. You know, any of that chop and any of those white caps would look closer and closer together. as it moved off into the distance on that ocean plane. And here again, coming back in the foreground, building up some of the sea spray coming off of the cresting wave. And I do see some brush strokes that are a little heavy and breaking those up, but I'm also pulling some of that white paint down into the wave to create some of the illusion of movement and some of the striations you would see in some of the waves. If you ever stand by the sea and watch, you'll often see striations in these bigger waves that kind of raise up. I'm trying to replicate that by pulling some of that white foam paint down into the wave itself. And we'll just keep working through until we get it close to what we want to see. So we're in the home stretch now, and I'll take a couple more passes through and around this painting in the normal or typical kind of weaving process that I'll follow, moving from the foreground to the midground to the background, from the ocean to the sky, just taking steps back in between brush strokes to kind of take in the painting, kind of meet it where it's at, and ask myself the question, what can I do to elevate the painting? What can I do to enhance, the feel of the painting and the illusion of detail, the illusion of three-dimensionality as I work my way through? And you can see I tried to create some additional striations closer to the horizon line in the ocean. And now just taking time to observe the painting and realizing that there may be opportunities to enhance the intensity and the contrast between the light and the dark in the sky, and just patting in with a smaller flat brush some additional brighter hues into the sky closer to the horizon line, concentrated where the sun is about to come up over the horizon there, or go down over the horizon rather. And also selectively pick some spots where the rays will be bouncing off of some of the more vertical planes on the edges of the cloud cover. And kind of like the way it's shaping up. And then I'll use that same brush that I used earlier. I'll use the very edges, the very tips, with a slight pat and sideways brush stroke. Again, that's with a dry brush, just to break up some of the lighter whitish green pigment, just to break it up a little bit. It was just a little too solid in spots, and want that foam to be such that it looks like it's breaking apart as the wave crashes. And I'll put some dabs of brighter paint just to get some brighter highlights and enhance some of the contrast in select areas in the foreground here with these waves, just to pull it forward a little bit more. You generally will see more detail, more contrast in the foreground, and I'm just trying to pull these waves forward a little bit and further enhance that illusion of three-dimensionality. And I think we're getting real close to wrapping up this painting at this point. Probably soften some of those last few brush strokes after I put in a few more suggestions of cresting waves and white caps.
No, I put what was
might
left.
Break some of that up a little bit
with
with the back of my brush again, creating some of those horizontal striations, trying to create the illusion of multiple sets of waves coming in off into the distance, and also break up some of the foam in the foreground here. But I want to thank you for watching, and appreciate it if enjoyed this coverage of this George Inness painting in my Study the Great series. I'd invite you to check out some of the other episodes. Some of them are 100% time-lapse, so it would take only a couple of minutes for you to view. Others are more long form like this. I also have some videos of original paintings and the process that I followed. In the Study of the Great series, as I mentioned earlier, I've covered George Inness quite a few times, but also several others, including Charles Warren Eaton and Edward Bannister, Van Gogh now, and Monet as well. So we just invite you to check it out. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Please share and like if you haven't done so already. Maybe even subscribe to my channel. And again, thanks again for spending some time with me. I hope you enjoyed. And wish you well. Stay well. And I hope you have a wonderful day. We're just going to close this out with a little bit of music. And again, be well, stay well. Hope to see you soon.